Are you struggling to figure out what your notified body wants for a usability engineering file? Or maybe you just submitted your 510K and the FDA rejected your usability testing. The testing that you spent tens of thousands of dollars on and took you months to complete, the FDA rejected it. 90% of the companies out there that submit a 510K with usability testing have that testing rejected, and they have to repeat that testing, or they have to rewrite their reports, or they have to redo their risk analysis. All you want to do is know how to do this. The problem is there isn't any straightforward, simple training that explains it step by step, what to do and when to do it. They don't tell you the differences between what the FDA reviewer wants and what the really poorly written guidance from 2016 that's outdated says. And when you try to follow the ISO standard, ISO 62366-1 2015, that seems completely different. So I can't even follow the recognized standard. That seems bizarre to me, particularly if I'm a European company that's used to always having to follow a standard. If it's a recognized standard, why can't I just follow it? So if you want to understand our 10-step process, watch this video, and you can download the slide deck. There's going to be a link down below for our blog that we posted yesterday. It's on the human factors process. You can download that slide deck. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to show you a few slides that are from that slide deck. One of them outlines the 10 steps, and it's also in the article. Number two, we're going to show you what a use-related risk analysis table looks like. That's also from the article. But if you stay tuned to the very end of this presentation, I'm going to show you where each of those 10 steps fit in the design process. So when you're looking at design planning, design inputs, development, verification, validation testing, final release, and your post-market activities, what usability activities am I supposed to be doing during each of those stages? Because I need to come up with a usability plan, and I need to put it in my usability engineering file. And I have to either put that in my technical file or my DHF or my risk management file or all the above. So this is the video for you. It's going to explain it in simple 10 steps. So here we go. I'm going to share those 10 steps with you. Number one, define human factors for your device or IVD. Number two, identify use errors. Number three, conduct a URRA, or a use-related risk analysis. That's different from the guidance that tells you to do either FMEA or fault tree. But all the deficiency letters coming back, they are giving us an example of a URRA, and that's what they want us to use. Number four, perform a critical task analysis. Nowhere does it say critical task in the standard, unfortunately, and nowhere in 14971 does it talk about critical tasks, and nowhere in 24971 does it talk about critical tasks. So what's a critical task? Conduct a risk control option analysis. That's step 5. Step 6, conduct formative usability testing. 7, implement your risk controls. This is at your design freeze, right before you get into your V&V testing. Conduct your summative usability testing. That's part of your V&V testing. Then prepare your human factors engineering or usability engineering documentation, your file. And then last but not least, collect post-market surveillance data specific to use errors. So I'm going to walk you through each of these 10 steps. Okay. Step 1 is definition. This relates to 3 different clauses in ISO 62366-1 2015. So I'm always going to give you the clause for each of these sections. You want to define what the indications for use are for your device. Number 2, who are the intended users? And you want to break that down into user groups. And you're going to have probably more than one user group, especially if you have prescription use and over-the-counter use for your product. But just think about something like software that's used for radiology. You're going to have radiologists that are using it, and radiology technicians are going to be using it. So that's 2 different user groups with very different levels of skill training. Next, what is the intended use environment? So it could be a home use product, or it could be used in a hospital, or maybe even a nursing home. 3 different types of use environments. Next, what is the user interface for your device? What are the operating principles for your device or the IVD? So all those things together, indications, intended users, intended use environment, user interface, and the operating principles, all those together equal your use specification. And that's one of the terms in that ISO 62366 standard. And in the slide deck, wherever I have it bolded and all in caps, that's a definition in 62366 that you can look up. I'm also going to give you a link at the end of the presentation or down in the video below on where you can purchase 62366. It'll probably save you some bucks. Step 2, identify the use errors. Identify every step of the process for using the device or the IVD. You start with transportation, shipping it to the customer, installation if it requires installation, or how to plug it in, calibration of the device, operation of the device, cleaning it, reprocessing it, storing it, and disposal, particularly in Europe where you have specific legal requirements for the company to include instruction for use on how to safely and environmentally sound ways to dispose of the device, particularly with any hazardous things like a battery. Next, brainstorm as a team. So your design team should be getting together as a team and identifying any potential use errors. You want to review ISO 14971 2019 in Annex C, Table C1. They have a table on the far right-hand side of that table. That's where they cover use errors. And then in addition, you can go to the guidance document, ISO TR 24971-2020, and Annex A has a whole bunch of questions that'll help you brainstorm hazards that are associated with your device. You also want to review your complaint database if you have a previous version of this device to identify any use errors. You want to review the TPLC database, that's the total product lifecycle database that the FDA has for adverse events, and any other adverse event databases that would have similar devices on the market for competitors. And that'll help you identify the most serious adverse events. All that together is going to be used to identify what your use errors are for your, or potential use errors for your device. And you want to identify a user interface, and the characteristics of that are related to safety and use errors. Those are going to be the most critical of your use errors. The next step, you're going to want to create a URRA, or perform a use-related risk analysis. So I'm going to share my screen again. And here's an example that the FDA provided in deficiency letters showing what they expect for a use-related risk analysis. In the second column, what they're looking for you to do is list all the sequences of operation of your device, everything from storage to disposal, everything. Don't forget a step. And then from there, you identify the use errors that are possible for each of those steps. And not every step has a use error that's associated with it. If there's a specific hazard associated with that or a hazardous situation, and then identify what is the potential harm to the user or the patient, the severity of that harm. And when you've done all that, then at the very end of the process, you identify which of these tasks that you've identified from all the way from storage to disposal, which ones of those have the potential for harm, and those are critical tasks. However, the FDA goes one step further. They want you, in addition to identifying anything that can cause harm, anything that can prevent you from being able to perform the indication for use, that they also consider a critical task. So if it interferes with performing the intended use or indication for use of the device, or it can cause harm to the patient or user, that's definitely going to be a critical task in the eyes of the FDA. And then in the last two columns, what they're looking for is they want you to identify what risk controls you put in place. They call them risk mitigations, but you almost never completely eliminate the risk. So it's really a risk reduction, not a risk mitigation, but that's just semantics. And then the last step, they want you to explain where in your human factors testing have you addressed that particular risk control to make sure that it was effective. Okay. The next step of the process is your critical task analysis. So I believe we're at step 4 here. The critical task analysis, that applies to section 5.3, 5.4, and 5.5 of the 62366 standard. You want to identify any known or foreseeable hazards. So that URRA, the next step is what are the critical ones that are going to be hazards and hazardous situations and can cause harm. And those are going to be the ones that are critical tasks. Okay. The next step of the process, step 5, option analysis. So this is your option controls for risk control option analysis. Sorry. You want to have in this section testable technical requirements relevant to the user interface. So every single one of these critical tasks, you need to identify, how am I going to test this? Either in formative testing or in summative testing. How am I going to test this? It could be benchtop testing even. Some sort of simulation to show how are you going to make sure that this risk control you implemented to prevent this use error actually works. Maybe actually try to perform it incorrectly and see if your risk control prevents the person from doing it, or at least pops up a warning, says, don't do this. So that would be a protective measure. This constitutes your user interface specification. So what parts of the user interface are going to give you, are going to include risk controls to prevent these hazards, and how effective are they? That's in your user interface specification. You're going to say how you're going to test that. And as part of your design plan, create a user interface evaluation plan. So it says step by step how we're going to test each of these. That should be part of your design plan. Step, I think we're at 6 now, formative testing. This covers clauses 5.72 and 5.8 in the 62366 standard. For formative testing, I'm going to give you some guidelines. So number 1, there are no formal requirements for formative testing. It's an iterative process. So formative testing is not something you do once. It's something you typically do multiple times to look at different things. If you're familiar with the lean startup, or you're familiar with agile development for software, you come up with a minimum viable product or a very simple version of your product, and you test specific user interfaces and see if those risk controls that you're trying work. And if they don't, try another one. Or maybe you have 2 different ideas and you're not sure which one will work better. The problem is, whenever you do this formative testing, even though it's formative testing, you're not required to have all the users be people that are actual users in the real world. They could be your staff. You want to be very careful that you don't rely only on your own staff, because the biomedical engineer that developed the device and is familiar with all the problems with it is far less likely to make those use errors than somebody from the real world that's an actual user of the device. So ultimately, you're going to have to do that. And if you wait until you get to summative testing, you may get a surprise and have to repeat everything. So you don't want to have a scenario like that, and you have to go back and change your design of your device for the user interface. You want to test some real world users at some point during the development process in some formative testing. You want to make sure that the formative testing is evaluating different design options. That's one use. Another use would be to identify any unforeseen use errors that you hadn't even thought of during your brainstorming sessions, or uncovered when you were doing, let's say, a state-of-the-art review or a review of adverse event databases. You can use your formative testing to develop instructions for use, or an IFU. You can use it to develop training materials. So while you're doing summative testing or formative testing, you might record some of that with video, and you can use that as your materials for training, as like end user training during launching at a new hospital. You're going to do some in-service training, show them how to use your device, use the videos that you develop during those sessions. And then consider one last thing, the evaluation of training decay. Training decay is the amount of time that's gone by from the time that you were trained to the first time you ever actually used the device during the testing. Now, sometimes that might be 10 minutes, it might be an hour, it might be a day, it might be a month. But in general, the longer the time goes by from the time you were trained to the first time you used the device, the less of the important instructions you remember. You might forget important details. So at the very least, you want to be looking at a minimum of training decay of 1 hour from the time you train them to the time that they actually perform the operations with the device. But you might want to evaluate what the training decay should be during formative testing, so you can put that into your summative protocol. The next step is implementation of the risk controls. After you've done that iterative testing for formative testing, you finally decided which risk controls for the user interface are going to work best. So this is the point at which you're going to say, these are our final risk controls, and you're going to implement. This is design freeze. You got to remember, for risk controls, it's always first reduce the use-related risks by design. Number two, reduce the use-related risk with protective measures, like a pop-up alarm that warns the person, are you sure? Please acknowledge this before going forward. Or maybe it beeps or alarms, or a light indicator comes up, something to prevent you from making a use error. And then last but not least, you can use any kind of labeling or information provided to the user. This could also include training that you provide the user, but that's going to be the least effective. So it should always be in that order. Implement your design solutions first, your protective measures second, and then provide information, including training to the users to prevent those use errors. Okay, the next step, now we're into the verification validation phase, summative testing. So summative testing is your final validation that your user interfaces work to prevent use errors. Number one, you need a prospective approved protocol. It's required. You need to identify what the IFU version is that's going to be used in this study. And if there are any changes between that and what you actually submit, you got to explain why those changes don't require you to repeat everything. Next, each user group must be identified. So just before, when I said this is a use specification, you need to make sure that that specification of who the user groups are, and if there are multiple ones, you need to define that in the summative protocol. You have to have at least 15 users per user group according to the FDA. And for certain devices where there's a special controls guidance document, it will be more. So for instance, if you're doing an IVD for over-the-counter use for COVID detection, it's going to be a minimum of 30 laypersons. If you're doing a blood glucose sensor or monitor, so you're going to measure your blood glucose because you're diabetic, that's going to be 350 people. So it depends on which device you've got, and if there's a special controls guidance document that tells you a specific number other than what the human factors guidance document says. In addition, it must be conducted in the USA. There are occasions where the FDA will make exceptions on a case-by-case basis, but in order to do that, you're going to have a pre-sub meeting and ask the FDA and propose a plan, and they're going to have to agree to it. If you don't do that ahead of time, you're not going to have any luck during the actual substantive review. They're just going to give you a deficiency. And that includes, it's not just an English speaking issue. So doing it in Canada, Ireland, UK, Australia, that isn't necessarily a solution. Next, instructions for use must be scripted. So you have your instructions for use document. You can give that to them and they can review it and they can refer to it all they want. But if you're going to give them any verbal instructions, so you have the moderator tell them what to do or how to do it or give them any training, that has to be scripted. And once again, remember, you got to take into account training decay. Your design should always address that training decay. All critical tasks must be performed by the user and verified by the moderator. Video recordings recommended. We haven't seen the FDA actually request these videos, but they expect you to be recording these. And you should consider getting IRB approval. It's not necessarily required because this is simulated use, not actual use. But if there's any potential for harm in a usability study, you definitely want to get IRB approval first before you do the study. The next step of the human factors process, that's preparing the human factors engineering report or usability engineering report. That section is 4.2 of the 62366 standard. And I don't remember whether I said the sections of the standard for summative testing. It's 5.7.3 and 5.9 for summative and 4.2 for the human factors engineering or usability engineering file. The usability engineering file, it includes a summary of all your activities that you've done throughout the usability testing, throughout the whole entire design process, and what those outputs are. So you're providing a summary of it, a lot like you would in a risk management report. And you can include this usability engineering report in your design file, or in your risk management file. And then the last step of the process is collecting use error through the post-market surveillance process. For this, you want to proactively gather information about use errors in general. So you want to always be asking, have you had any use errors? Did you have any near misses where you almost did something incorrectly, or you got confused, or something was hard to understand and you had to refer to the instruction for use? Be proactive and ask questions about that. And ask them in an open-ended way. Otherwise, you'll always get the answer yes. Next, monitor the frequency and severity of any use errors that you've already identified in your use-related risk analysis. Evaluate the need to update your use-related risk analysis after you've collected this post-market data. And if you update your use-related risk analysis, consider updating your IFU as well. It's always okay to update your IFU if you're adding in warnings and precautions. It's not okay to remove those without getting regulatory approval, but you're always welcome to add them. Okay, and now, as I promised at the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you our diagram for where this all fits in the risk management process. So I've shown you in this series of arrows at the top, you have the planning phase of design. There aren't any real human factors steps that are there. I suppose you could come up with a usability plan and you could put it in your design plan, but usually you're going to gather some more information about the definition of the user interface and the use specifications, and you're going to try to figure out what the use errors are before you're going to come up with a plan for how you're going to test them. So a usability test plan is probably going to be a little bit later. So it's probably not going to be during that phase. It's going to be later in the process. For the design input stage, you want to define your usability user interface issues. You want to identify any use errors, and you want to perform your use-related risk analysis. It's very similar to performing a hazard analysis. In the next phase, development of your product, where you're going to have an iterative process and you're going to try different risk controls and design solutions to try to prevent any use errors. You're going to do a critical task analysis to identify each of the steps that would be use errors that might cause harm, and anything that would prevent you from actually performing the indication for use. You're going to try a risk control option analysis, try to figure out which of these solutions works best, and you're going to do formative testing to prove which one works best, rather than just rely on your own guess. Then you're going to have a design freeze, and you're going to start your V&V testing. For the V&V testing, that point at that design freeze, that's where you're implementing risk controls, and then you do your summative testing. So that implement risk controls should really be right on the interface between those two arrows rather than more on the V&V side. And then the summative testing is firmly in the V&V testing, probably at the later end, particularly if you're going to do any clinical studies. You might write two protocols, one for the clinical study and one for the summative testing, and you can do them both at the same time, but you want to keep them in separate protocols. After you've completed all your testing, then you could submit that usability testing with the URRA, the critical task analysis, the protocol for the summative testing, and the final report for the summative testing to the FDA in your 510K. If you're submitting a CE marking technical file, you're going to have to summarize all that information, which will take you longer because it's in a summary document. You have to collect it all in a file, and you're going to have to send that over as part of your risk management file or in your design history file to the technical reviewer for your notified body. So that's typically after you've done your 510K submission. It might be even after you get 510K clearance, depending on how long it takes you to do all that technical documentation for your CE marking. Once you've completed your 510K clearance, then you're ready for post-market surveillance, because now you're going to launch your product, and notified bodies want to see some evidence that you've actually been doing post-market surveillance in post-market clinical follow-up studies. So they're going to ask you to collect use errors through the post-market surveillance. The FDA expects you to gather post-market surveillance data on use errors. And normally it's through the complaint handling process, but a better method is to be proactive and actually have a plan and questions going out to users. You also want to gather other types of post-market surveillance data, but anything that's going to help you and you want to make sure you review your URRA. Does it need to be updated? And do you need to update your IFU as well? So those are all the steps. And I've even shown design transfer here. That would start when you first have design freeze and would go all the way through to production once you hit commercial production. So those design transfer activities, it's not one thing, not one day. It's a whole host of activities that usually take several months to implement. So that's the entire design process, showing you all the key tasks that have to be done for the human factors process. I hope that's helpful to you. There are 10 steps there. And this slide gives you contact information. So if you want to contact me, there's email, there's phone, and a calendar link if you want to set up a special meeting with your company and me where I can answer any of your questions about usability testing. I hope that was helpful for you. And like I said, don't forget to click on the links below to download your free slide deck or to read the article on the human factors process. Thank you and see you later.